The first light of December 27, 1942, crept over the Owen Stanley Mountains, casting long shadows across the airfield at Port Moresby. In the quiet hum before dawn, a young pilot sat alone in the cockpit of his P-38 Lightning, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. He was 22. He had never fired a shot in combat, and yet within minutes he would fly straight into the path of 40 Japanese aircraft. The manuals he studied back in the United States had promised clarity, clean diagrams, perfect angles, simple solutions to complex problems. But nothing in those pages mentioned what it felt like to swallow fear, tighten your harness, and wait for an order that might be your last. That morning, the world did not yet know his name, not the ground crews, not the men fighting for their lives on the beaches below. But in the next 2 years, this quiet farm kid would become the best American fighter ace of World War II, rewriting what it meant to survive in the skies. And the question that lingers is this: how does a young man with everything to lose become the ace of aces? And why has nearly everyone forgotten him? Richard Bong did not come from a military lineage or a legacy of pilots. He came from dairy fields and cold Wisconsin mornings where the horizon was wide and quiet and uncomplicated. At flight school, instructors taught him that air combat followed rules charts, energy diagrams, carefully rehearsed maneuvers. They insisted that discipline would keep him alive. But those rules were written by men who had never fought a zero at 10,000 feet. In the Pacific, the war operated by different laws. The P-38 Lightning, he flew with powerful twin engines, brutal acceleration, heavy guns mounted in the nose. It could outrun nearly anything Japan put in the air, but it could not turn with the Mitsubishi A6M0. The Zero was lighter, sharper, frighteningly agile. Instructors warned every young pilot, never turn with the Zero. It was not a guideline, it was a death sentence. When Bong arrived in New Guinea in late 1942, he carried that doctrine like a shield. But he also carried doubt. Rumors drifted through the squadron, stories from men who had survived their first encounters. They spoke of chaos of tactics falling apart the moment a Zero appeared out of the sun. They spoke of dives that came too late or climbs that ended in a stall. They spoke of wingmen disappearing in seconds. Bong listened. He wondered what combat would ask of him. Then he met Captain Thomas Tommy Lynch. Lynch was only 26, but already carried the confidence of a man who had earned every scar on his aircraft. He had flown the P-39 Airacobra, a plane so outmatched by the Zero that pilots called it a death trap. Yet Lynch survived. He understood energy better than any textbook. He knew how to force an enemy into a mistake. And most importantly, he knew that doctrine meant nothing when the sky turned violent. On the morning of the Buna mission, Lynch gave Bong a briefing so short, it barely seemed like a briefing at all. No lectures, no diagrams, no reminders of what the manual said. Just a simple instruction. Stay on my wing. Don't think, react. If I dive, you dive. If I break, you break. In that moment, Bong understood he was not there to win glory. He was there to stay alive. The climb over the Owen Stanley Mountains was deceptively calm. The ocean below seemed peaceful, the sun rising in soft colors. But at altitude, more than 30 Japanese aircraft were closing the distance, Zeros and Valdai bombers forming a column of steel and fire. Bong tightened his grip on the controls. This was no longer a training range in California. This was the place where doctrine met reality. And reality struck fast. The first burst of fire, the first desperate turn, the first moment he felt the P-38 shudder. Beneath him, these became the true beginning of his education. In that chaos, Bong learned what every veteran pilot already knew. Survival was not about following rules. It was about letting go of them. The lessons came hard in those first weeks of 1943. Combat in New Guinea offered no gentle introductions. Every engagement was a test of instinct, discipline, and luck. Richard Bong rose quickly, not because he was fearless, but because he understood fear better than most. It sharpened his focus. It made every decision heavier, and it taught him to pay attention to what experienced pilots like Tommy Lynch were doing when the sky turned hostile. By January, Bong had already tasted the violent rhythm of air combat across the Pacific escort missions over the Annan Gulf, dives through tracer fire at Leh, and desperate climbs during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. In those moments, he began to see a pattern. Every time he followed the textbook holding range, firing long bursts from afar, the Zero slipped away. Every time he pressed closer, letting the enemy feel his windscreen, the fight changed. The shots landed. The kill came quickly. Lynch had warned him about this. Long-range deflection shooting looked elegant on paper, but the battlefield was not a straight line. Japanese pilots twisted, rolled, and reversed with a ferocity that turned theory into dust. Bong realized that his neatly practiced gunnery skills from Arizona meant little when the target was alive, unpredictable, and fighting to survive. So he adapted. He began closing the distance 200 yards, 100, sometimes 50, close enough to feel the vibration of his own gun shake through the cockpit, close enough to see the sunlight flash off the enemy's canopy, close enough that missing was no longer an option. It was a terrifying way to fight one that demanded he fly straight into danger rather than skirt around it. But it worked, and once he understood it, he refined it. He studied how Japanese pilots escaped pressure, how they reversed when threatened, how they dove the moment a P-38 appeared behind them. Bong learned to be patient, not firing too early, not turning too sharply, waiting for the precise instant when the Zero committed to an evasive move. Then he struck, placing his P-38 exactly where the enemy would be, not where he was. A short burst, a flash, a spiral of smoke disappearing into the jungle below. It was more than skill, it was anticipation. By mid-1943, Bong and Lynch were locked in a friendly race, each tracking the other's victories, each pushing to get better. The newspapers back home turned them into symbols, broadcasting their scores like standings in a national sport. Americans wanted heroes, and the two pilots from the 39th Fighter Squadron gave them something to believe in. But behind the headlines, the competition had a sharper edge. Every kill meant another mission survived. Every mission survived meant one more chance to see tomorrow. And through it all, Bong's reputation grew, not as a man who followed doctrine, but as the pilot who flew close enough that he simply could not miss. In the skies over New Guinea, he was becoming something new, something dangerous, something the Japanese had not expected. A fighter who rewrote the rules. By early 1944, Richard Bong and Tommy Lynch were more than wingmen. They were partners in survival. Two pilots shaped by the same brutal skies, each pushing the other toward sharper instincts and deadlier precision. But war has a way of choosing its moments with cold indifference, and it chose March 8, 1944 over Itep Harbor. The mission looked simple at first: strafed Japanese supply barges hidden along the coastline. Low altitude, quick passes, a clean escape. But nothing in New Guinea was ever that clean. As Lynch went in for a second run, anti-aircraft guns concealed beneath layers of jungle opened fire with sudden clarity. A burst of 20mm shells struck his P-38's right engine. Flames ripped along the boom, smoke poured behind him in a black ribbon, stretching across the sky. Bong watched from above, powerless. He saw Lynch fight for altitude climbing. Desperately, 100 feet, 202,000 was the goal. Anything that would give a parachute time to open. But the fire spread faster than the climb. Metal peeled, pieces fell away, the cockpit glowed with heat. Lynch had no choice. He bailed out. And Bong saw the same nightmare he would one day share, the parachute rippling open. Too low, too late, swallowed by the green canopy below. He called on the radio. No answer. He circled again, still nothing. Fuel warning lights blinked. Ground fire tracked him. He marked the coordinates, turned away, and flew home alone. When he landed, the silence in the debriefing room was heavier than any loss the squadron had endured. 3 days of search teams found nothing. Only rumors, only hope fading into resignation. Tommy Lynch, mentor, rival, protector, was gone. Bong did not fly for a week. General Kenny grounded him, insisting he needed rest, but rest offered no comfort. Every night he replayed the moment. The parachute disappeared into the trees. Every morning he woke with the same question: why him and not me? The war was teaching him a new lesson. No matter how skilled you were, no matter how disciplined, survival still depended on moments outside your control. When he returned to the cockpit, something inside him had shifted. He flew with sharper focus, but the recklessness of youth had burned away. He no longer chased kills to win the friendly competition he once shared with Lynch. Now he flew to keep his wingmen alive, to finish the mission, to go home. Yet his skill only grew. In the months that followed, Bong's victories began to stack single engagements, tight bursts at impossible ranges, zero after zero, falling under the weight of his precision. By April 1944, he reached his 27th confirmed kill, surpassing Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record. Newspapers across America hailed him as the best American fighter ace of World War II, the new ace of aces. But Bong didn't celebrate. He felt only the quiet truth. Every veteran learns records are paid for and friends you can't bring back. And Tommy Lynch was the one he carried with him everywhere. After breaking the long-standing American record, Richard Bong returned to the United States for a brief and uncomfortable season of fame. Factories cheered. Reporters crowded in. Every newspaper called him the best American fighter ace of World War II, a symbol of American skill and resolve in the Pacific. Yet Bong never felt at home in that spotlight. The applause reminded him of what wasn't being said, the fear, the smoke, the men who didn't make it back. The real war never fit into a radio broadcast. When he returned to the Pacific in September 1944, it was not as a frontline fighter pilot, but as an advanced gunnery instructor for 5th Fighter Command. Officially, he wasn't required to fly combat again. Unofficially, he refused to stay on the ground. The Philippines campaign was underway, and American forces were fighting through some of the fiercest resistance of the war. Bong quietly joined hazardous missions over Balikpapan and Leyte, slipping into formations as if he were still a squadron pilot. Each time he carried the same philosophy that had brought him this far close. The distance control, the fight, ended quickly. The wider world barely noticed these missions, but their strategic impact was clear. Their pilots no longer wasted time trying to outturn P-38 Lightnings. They adapted, using hit-and-run attacks, diving from altitude, striking fast before vanishing into cloud cover. The easy engagements were gone. Each kill now required patience, timing, and absolute mastery of the aircraft. In this environment, Bong added 8 more victories, climbing to 40 confirmed kills. It was more than a personal milestone. It signaled a tactical shift within the U.S. Army Air Forces. General Kenny, once skeptical of Bong's reckless short-range approach, began quietly encouraging other pilots to study it. After the war, these principles, aggressive positioning, controlled closure, decisive engagement, found their way into fighter doctrine. Yet even as his influence grew, his memory did not. The American public, exhausted by years of war, turned its attention to Europe's final battles, to the slow push toward Tokyo, to the promise of peace. Fighter Aces, once headline material, faded from the national conversation. It was an irony Bong understood well. He was shaping the future of American air combat, even as history began to forget him. Richard Bong should have lived long enough to see the world he helped shape. He should have grown old in Wisconsin, telling quiet stories at veterans gatherings, teaching young pilots how to trust their instincts more than their manuals. Instead, he spent his final months testing America's first operational jet fighter, the P-80 Shooting Star. It was dangerous work, but danger had never frightened him. What frightened him was standing still. On August 6, 1945, the engine on his P-80 failed shortly after takeoff. The aircraft rolled, the cockpit filled with smoke, and Bong did the only thing he could. He tried to bail out. It was the same cruel physics that had taken Tommy Lynch too low, not enough altitude, not enough time. He died just miles from the Lockheed plant on a peaceful California morning, as the news of Hiroshima broke across every radio in the nation. His death should have been a national moment. It should have echoed through the halls of the War Department. For a brief time, it did. Newspapers placed his story beside the headline announcing the atomic bomb. But the world was changing too fast, and the age of single-seat heroes faded, as jet warfare and geopolitics took center stage. What survived was not the fame, but the craft. The tactics Bong refined in the Pacific, closing the range, dictating the geometry of the fight, trusting speed and nerve over distant calculations, became part of the American fighter pilot's DNA. Every generation that followed inherited a piece of his philosophy, whether they knew the name behind it or not. In that sense, the best American fighter ace of World War II still flies with them. Yet memory is fragile. Outside his hometown museum in Wisconsin sits a restored P-38 Lightning, its silver skin catching the light just as his once did. Inside, behind glass, are his letters, uniforms, and fragments of the jet that failed him. Visitors walk slowly, reading the captions, piecing together the life of a man who never asked to be remembered, but deserves to be. And so the question becomes ours. What should we carry forward? The record, the medals, or the quiet determination of a young pilot who rewrote the rules to keep others alive? If this story leaves you thinking about the cost of courage, I invite you to share your reflections below. Tell us what this history means to you. And if you want to explore more forgotten stories of World War II, stories that shaped the world we live in, consider subscribing. Because every memory we keep keeps someone else's story alive.